Welcome to this exclusive interview by Fundación Civismo. I am Jorge González-Gallarza. I'm Civismo's executive director, and I am delighted to be speaking today with David Hoffman. David is an award-winning writer and journalist. He's currently a contributing editor of the Washington Post. He sits on the editorial board of that newspaper. He began his career covering Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, and later his subsequent administration. He joined the Post in 1982, where his coverage of the White House earned him 3 National Journalism Awards. In 1992, he became Jerusalem bureau chief, and after studying Russian at Oxford, he served for 6 years as Moscow bureau chief. He has published a wide array of books, of which I'm just going to cite the last 4. In 2002, he published The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia. In 2010, he published The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. In 2015, he wrote The $1 Billion Spy, A True Story of Cold War Espionage and Betrayal. And most recently, and most relevant to our conversation today, David is the author this year of a wonderful new book called Give Me Liberty, The True Story of Oswaldo Payá and His Daring Quest for a Free Cuba. David, let me get right into the heart of the question with the following ask. You've had a truly distinguished and quite unique career covering different countries, Russia, Israel. What made you turn to Cuba after 40 years of covering those parts of the world? What was interesting about Cuba to you?
It wasn't so much a place as a person. When I was a Moscow correspondent, I sometimes had the chance to get out of Moscow and visit other cities and see. Russia's huge, so it's a big task. But I was in Nizhny Novgorod, the former Gorky, and I was very interested in Andrei Sakharov and had a chance to visit this cabin, this little dacha in the woods where he wrote his famous essay, Reflections. And I got to thinking a lot, reading Sakharov and thinking about it. What inspires one man like him? He was part of the Soviet elite. He was father of the hydrogen bomb. What inspires somebody like him to take on a totalitarian system? And in Sakharov's case, to take it on in a very intellectual and penetrating way. The KGB chief Andropov had bugs put in the house. They were afraid of Sakharov because of his, he was a giant. And this idea of one man up against the system has always interested me. What inspiration and courage and determination and stamina does it take to do this? And another book I wrote, The $1 Billion Spy, is about a man named Adolf Tolkachev, who was a radar engineer in the Soviet system and volunteered secrets to the United States. And one day when the CIA officer asked Tolkachev, "Why are you doing this, risking your life and everything?" Tolkachev said, "Because I'm fed up with the hypocrisy and the lies, and the Soviet system drove him to do this." Again, one man up against the system at great risk. So later, when I was a manager and executive, top editor of the foreign staff at the Washington Post, I heard about Oswaldo Payá and the Varela Project. I assigned a reporter to visit him, and we published a story. It was interesting, but I didn't know a lot about it until tragically his death. And at the time he died, I was sitting on the editorial board. And frankly, I had just arrived there a few weeks earlier, and I immediately raised my hand and said, I'd like to write about this. And I was completely hooked because it was evident to me right away, Oswaldo Payá was of Sakharov's stature.
Yes.
So I got into this not because of Cuba, Jorge. I got into this because want to know what drove Oswaldo Payá to challenge the dictatorship. What was the source of his courage? What were the methods and the means, by which one person takes on a state?
Yes. Yes, wonderful. And as you said, your book really, really zeroes in on the life of Oswaldo and sort of some of the motivating factors behind his lifelong quest to free Cuba of totalitarian communism. And one of the things that you document in the book to a great extent is that Oswaldo was a man of faith. He was driven by his faith. He worked for many years within the sort of within the internal politics of the church, within the diocese, to have the Catholic Church show a more contrarian face against the regime of Castro. What was Payá's sort of what were was he a man of faith before he was a man of the opposition? What was his driving motive, underneath this all?
Well, these two things go together. First of all, you have to realize that Oswaldo Payá never lived in a free country. He was born at the time, right, 10 days before Batista's coup. He was about 7 years old when Castro took power. And he lived his whole life basically under dictatorship. When he was 13 years old, he saw Fidel's militias confiscate his father's private business. He was later sent to the UMAP, to the forced labor camps, because he was a contrarian. He was pressured to leave the physics program at the University of Havana because of his views. So he had, first of all, spent a long time. A big part of that life from childhood on was his faith. The parish, El Cerro, was a place where 4 generations of his family had worshipped at that church. And even as a young man, Oswaldo saw the church as kind of a safe haven for freedom of thought. And a great deal of credit for this goes to Padre Alfredo Petit, who was sent to the church to be the parish priest when Oswaldo was a young man. And Petit created an environment for the youth group there and told them that this place, El Salvador del Mundo was the name of the church, was absolutely protected. And you could say anything you want. And he encouraged these young people to believe in freedom of thought within the confines. So Oswaldo began to realize and associate the church with this freedom. And he actually came to kind of a life conclusion that rights are bestowed by God and not by Fidel and not by the state. And I think he reached this at the very early time when Petit was encouraging the youth group. Other things around him in that church, there's a big foyer in this particular parish church. And after Mass, especially on Sunday, the parents, it was big clans belonged to the church. Several large families, they gathered in the foyer to have candid discussions about things they had heard, sometimes on subversive radio or a book somebody had brought underground. So again, Oswaldo saw there was free thought there with his parents in the foyer. And later, as a young man, when he was fighting a lot of this discrimination, he wrote down once what he had seen, and he recalled that Christians, Catholics, particularly in Cuba, all the time he was growing up, were subject to discrimination. They were pushed to the edges of society. They were marginalized. His mother talked about his mother and his aunt Beba would walk the boys and the daughter to the church down Bignon Street. And, his mother wrote that she was sometimes hit with stones, and people from the regime threw rotten eggs at the doors of the church. And when a holiday and a mass was underway, they would take motorcycles with very loud and drive them in a circle around the building to disrupt it. And once they tarred the doors of the church and the car of the priest. And this constant pressure, discrimination, being pushed to the edges of society weighed deeply on Oswaldo, because he saw the inside of that parish church as a temple of freedom. When he came back from the UMAP camps, and at the time he was searching for kind of a young man's future, what to do, he eventually wound up teaching physics in high school, but he formed a club in the church, which he was still very associated with, a club of free thought. And this was a quite subversive thing to do in Castro's dictatorship. And, he wasn't quite sure how it was going to work out. He invited friends, and the first meeting, the first discussion was to be about this terrific role model, Felix Varela. Varela, a teacher, religious figure, but also a great voice for Cuban independence. And the meetings were oversubscribed. I mean, people just flooded into the room because the chance to have freedom of thought. So this club also became associated with Oswaldo's quest. This became a more determined and specific part of his political thinking as an adult. He was in his 30s and in the 1980s, and the church in Cuba was particularly in very bad shape. At the time of the Medellin conference and then the conference in Puebla, in which the church in Latin America was essentially rethinking where it should be, its relationship to society and especially to the poor. This great upheaval and reflection sort of struck the Cuban bishops as something that was passing them by. They were at Puebla and they were at Medellin, and they thought, it's not about our world because we are struggling to survive. And people might wonder, what am I talking about? People, it's because Catholics were discouraged from actually showing outward signs of their faith, and people were stoned on the way. One time, the church itself was starved for resources. All of its schools had been taken over and nationalized, and the schools were the backbone of much of what the church did. There were still some other functions, but everything was stressed to the point where one priest, said, we don't even have paper to, put out a little newsletter once a month. And somebody in the parish, this wasn't Oswaldo's, this was another one, went to his workplace and snitched a set of paper. And when the person brought this from the workplace, the priest said, okay. And he blessed it because he said, the purpose here is a higher noble cause. But literally the church had no paper. It had, believers were underground. People were persecuted. Oswaldo thought very hard how to cope with this situation. And one of the bishops who was at Pueblo and had gone through this reflection of what was wrong was Jaime Ortega. And Ortega was rising voice in the church and eventually became the Archbishop of Havana and the most senior. And in 1983, the other bishops put him in charge of a process that they began to kind of figure out a future for this battered, literally existentially threatened church in Castro's dictatorship. And I don't have to give you a lot of numbers, Jorge, but it's shocking to see that at this time there were so few priests and nuns in Cuba that sometimes a padre would have to go to 10 different parishes. One man. How can he possibly minister to 10 parishes? The number of nuns was a fraction of what it had been before the revolution. So one way the church was starved is that they weren't training. The seminaries were empty. There were very few, and the faithful were underground and persecuted. So a really important moment came when Jaime Ortega took on this assignment to decide what to do. And he decided that he needed some help. And he looked around to ask for young people because he was really interested in having young people help the Archbishop, and he asked people who would be enthusiastic and young and help him out. And Jaime Ortega was from Matanzas, and Oswaldo was from a family, Sardiñas, from Matanzas. And so word went out actually through one of his aunts that young Oswaldo Payá would be a great assistant for the Archbishop, and he took him on. So in 1984, Oswaldo Payá became an assistant to Jaime Ortega, and right in the middle of this great process, Ortega was serious about this. He went all around Cuba. Oswaldo arranged the meetings. They had polls, not modern polls, but, surveys asking people about their faith and, how they felt about it, how they felt about the church. And Oswaldo recorded a lot of it. He saw at this moment a great outpouring of unhappiness and distress among the faithful. He tasted this and smelled it and realized it firsthand. So Jaime decided to have a big conference, a nationwide conference. It would meet in 1986, but it'd be prepared in 1985, in which they would sort of confront all of these issues. And Oswaldo was asked again to be a delegate to the conference, and his fiancée at the time, Ophelia, also. And there was a big preparatory meeting. So at the preparatory meeting, this is 1985, Oswaldo brought a presentation which he and Ophelia had written. It was titled Faith and Justice. And it was a speech in which he basically summoned the church to its highest calling, which, of course, he had remembered from time as a boy with Father Petit, that truth, freedom, liberty were values the church should defend. And, of course, for Oswaldo, under the nave of El Salvador del Mundo, this was a really basic part of his life. Unbeknownst to Oswaldo Payá, Jaime Ortega had another thing going on, which is he was secretly working on rapprochement with Fidel Castro. And Jaime Ortega believed that his mission was to actually save the church in Cuba from an existential threat, and that he had to somehow compromise with the Castro regime in order to do a noble thing, which is to keep the church from basically dying. And that's how dire the situation was. So you had these two people who had once worked together, Oswaldo and Jaime. They had once, a year earlier, worked closely on this, suddenly were at odds. And after Oswaldo's speech was finished, Jaime Ortega said, "You cannot give that speech at our conference. I cannot let Fidel Castro see what you're saying." And Oswaldo obeyed Jaime and didn't give it. But he was terribly, terribly shocked and disappointed that the church was basically refusing to do what he saw as its mission. I have to say that there is some logic to what Ortega was thinking also. He was not being a dictator like Castro. Ortega was not being a totalitarian or anything like that. He was trying to basically save the institution, and didn't really understand that Oswaldo also wanted to save the institution, but by asserting these values. And they went their separate ways. Oswaldo attended the final conference in February 1986, but he did not give the paper. He did give a talk, but a very interesting thing happened. The Pope had sent a special representative, and out in the courtyard at Varela House, this very special place in Havana, Oswaldo was introduced to the Pope's envoy, and in that moment handed him and said, "Please give this to the Pope." He gave him the speech, Faith and Justice. And Oswaldo felt very discouraged after this. After 1986, he concluded the church was not going to be the ship that would plow ahead with freedom and liberty. I want to add that at part of this time, the idea came to Oswaldo that he had an audience for some of these ideas of his. He and a friend had formed in the church a small, sort of a self-help session for parents in the parish about how to cope with your teenagers. It was a pretty important subject for a lot of parents. And Oswaldo talked to these parents about what it was like to actually have a teenager and to be a teenager in a repressive society, to have all of the things that you cared about denied. The crowd stood up and applauded. Oswaldo realized that he had a speaking voice and a message. And after that, he began to publish newsletters. The first one was, the main one was called Pueblo de Dios. And he began to publish them after things failed in the big conference. And Jaime Ortega asked him to stop publishing this newsletter. And again, you asked about his faith. Here we are many years after he was a young boy in that church, and he is still pushing these ideas. If you read Pueblo de Dios and put it in the context of the late 80s, Oswaldo Payá is preparing this smudgy, mimeographed newsletter and handing them out on Sundays all over Havana. And people would wait at the front of their parish churches for the car to come by to give them just a few copies. They would go hand to hand. So again, when Ortega asked him to stop, Oswaldo paused, and then he started again. And actually, they published 7 or 8 different editions of this over the years. It was another sign that Oswaldo Payá was a man not to be stopped.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, David, thank you for walking us through all of the steps in Osvaldo's journey within the Catholic Church and the way that he lived out his faith in a country that did not really tolerate Catholicism much. I want to ask a question about the Varela project. You were mentioning earlier the Cuban leader after whom Osvaldo's main project was called. One of the paradoxes about Osvaldo's career, so to speak, is that even though he stood athwart the Catholic Church's efforts to appease or to come to an agreement with the Catholic Church, politically, he was all for working within the confines of the totalitarian communist regime that ruled over the island, right? There was a clause within the Constitution that you mentioned, which allowed for the gathering of signatures to be submitted to the regime. And can you tell us a little bit more about what the Varela Project was?
The story is so amazing that even when I think about it now, it's so improbable. And of course, this is something I learned as a student of Russian history too. It's always the improbable ones that become the real thing. And remember, Oswaldo never lived in a state of liberty. It lived only in his mind. And I think that over time, as he went through the pressure and difficult struggle, he came to a conclusion that he used often in public later in life. And he said, we must become the protagonists of our own history and not the spectators. And I think this says everything about this incredible determination he had. But I must say that after the debacle of the conference and his struggle inside the church for change, he searched for a while to figure out what would come next. He realized that he wasn't only about changing his own situation. He wanted to change the country. And for that, he needed to mobilize people. Mobilization is very difficult because Fidel Castro and the revolution had an iron grip on everybody. They had the committees for the defense of the revolution on every block. There were no alternative sources, no channels, no public spaces that were not dominated by the revolution. So how does one man go about organizing in that kind of pressured environment? And for Oswaldo, there was a lot of trial and error. And I believe this was a formative thing. People often think that champions of liberty just spring as brilliant people upon the world. But in Oswaldo's case, it was actually a long, dusty trail. It starts with this idea that rights are given by God and not by the state. This idea actually comes sometimes referred to as natural rights. But Oswaldo wasn't some kind of philosopher king. He didn't get his ideas from books, Jorge. He got them largely from experience, from really walking the streets. And this idea that rights belong to every person, really are bestowed by God at birth, drove him very powerfully. So by 1990, having, seen the Berlin Wall collapsed. So I was thinking, how can I mobilize in Cuba? And he had some deep fears. One was the Tiananmen Square massacre really worried him. He was afraid Cuba would be really destroyed in violence, and he thought that if you sort of release the animal spirits, you could get riots or upheaval. He didn't want that. He was very much against violence. He said, bloodshed will not bring us liberty. At the same time, he was very taken with Lech Walesa and with the Solidarity movement. People remember that Walesa was the hero of Poland's fight against communism. Sometimes they forget that it took Walesa practically a decade. And Oswaldo was paying close attention in the 80s to Walesa. And the real successful stage of the Solidarity movement was when they created this round table with the communist authorities, which eventually led, of course, to the elections and to the transition. So Oswaldo, for a while, thought that he would create a movement which would be called Liberación and would be like Solidarity. But of course, the minute he started to organize it, some people were questioned, and he thought, no, we're not Solidarity. But he was searching and searching. I mean, for years, he tried to organize a transition program. He wrote a 42-page program for transition to democracy, single-spaced. It's elegant. It's also something nobody would read. And eventually, Oswaldo had heard about the 1940 Constitution. And I'll just mention here that this Constitution, which was a product of great frustration during the Cuban Republic with the struggle to build democracy, it did have a provision for a citizen initiative. And that provision said if 10,000 citizens sign a petition, they can submit legislation to the legislature and have a voice in the future of their country. And I personally think that this was really, at the time it was put in there, was a check. It stemmed from the experience of the Machadato and Batista. It was intended as kind of an emergency escape, so there would not be another Machadato. It was never used during the Auténtico period of 1940 to 52. When Fidel tore up the 1940 Constitution in 1959 and created the fundamental law, the basic law, he left this in there. He sort of cut and pasted the second part of the 1940 Constitution. Maybe Fidel thought, okay, since no one's ever tried it, I'll leave it in there. They gutted all the other rights, so why they left it, I'm not sure. But it was still in there. A man named Ricardo Bofill had actually tried to collect signatures in the late 1980s. Oswaldo knew him and knew of his effort. And I tell in the book about another fellow, a very important guy named Andres Solares, who also tried to collect signatures and was in prison for 6 years because of it. And Bofill was constantly harassed and frequently in prison. So Oswaldo decided in the early 90s to collect signatures for something. Maybe for the National Roundtable, he would borrow from Solidarity. To be honest with you, if you read the first handbill he put out, it wasn't clear what he would, he was collecting them for some principles of liberty and freedom, but he didn't have a program, not a very specific one. And guess what happened? Well, he didn't get a lot of signatures because it was a dictatorship and people were afraid. And he began to collect a few hundred. And about a year after it started in July of 1991, the regime created an acto de repudio, attacked his house, painted graffiti on the walls, overturned the table with the signatures and so on. That was the message, which is you can't do this. But for Oswaldo Payá, this was simply further stimulation that he must do it. And 92, 93, he toyed around with other ideas. And by 96, he finally had an inspiration. He said, why don't we actually take that provision in the Constitution and turn the law of the state against itself? Yeah. Why don't we use the law to collect signatures And this is when he conceived of the Varela Project, and he began to collect signatures for it. It was much simpler than the transition program, right? I told you that transition program was some 40 pages. The Varela Project was 5 simple principles, 5 demands for freedom: a free press, free speech, freedom of worship, free enterprise, freedom for political prisoners, and free elections. It was a very easy to grasp, simple package. And he launched it. It was kind of percolating along. He began to collect more signatures when Pope John Paul II came to Cuba. And in those days of that very, very important pilgrimage, at the very end of it especially, Pope John Paul said, we have to be the protagonists of our own history, not the spectators.
Yeah.
Oswaldo Payá was ecstatic. He was just, and after the Pope's visit, when people were chanting in the square, suddenly that more and more signatures, and it became very successful in the next few years. By May of 2002, Oswaldo Payá presented to the National Assembly 11,020 verified signatures, which state security, by the way, had tried to sabotage. But there, he finally became protagonist of his own history.
Yeah. And obviously, the Varela Project lives on, or at least parts of it live on in Cuba Decide, the initiative that was launched by Payá's daughter, Rosa Maria. But obviously, one of the things that really strike one after reading your book, David, is that there's no one in the Cuban opposition at this moment with who has attained quite the same stature as Payá. No one has quite managed to federate or to have the different segments of the opposition rally around behind the person, right? I mean, the opposition is divided. There are several standard bearers on the island. The opposition in Miami isn't always sort of on the same page. So why do you think the opposition hasn't been able to produce someone of Payá's stature?
Well, I think that you have to ask state security because they're the reason. Castro's secret police have devoted many, many years to the techniques of dividing and repressing opposition. This is a central part of dictatorship, which is that you exterminate and eliminate civil society. Civil society really refers to that connection between the people and the rulers, and their intermediaries, autonomous and independent, who carry that out: the press, the church, independent organizations. And Fidel, like the Soviet and the East Germans, destroyed civil society at the very beginning, and to this day has a mechanism. And if you look at the island today, there are leaders, Jose Daniel Ferrar, some of the leaders of the San Isidro movement, Luis Alcantara, they're all in prison. The people who could be leading this movement are unjustly jailed. And a lot of them now, over 1,000 people who came to the streets on July 11th. So I think that the reason is not that there's an absence of leadership. The reason is that this is a dictatorship that puts leaders of the people in prison. And frankly, look at the example of Václav Havel, of Andrei Sakharov. We have a lot of Nelson Mandela. There's a lot of examples. This dictatorship's not very new or imaginative. These are old 20th century efforts to keep a hand on power. I have to say, Oswaldo believed that the future of Cuba would have to be decided from within. Once in the Mariel boat lift, he had a big group of relatives in Miami from his mother's side. All of his mother's brothers and sisters had fled during the 1960s, and the Sardiñas family was big. They brought their boats, and they said, Oswaldo, come with us. We've come here to take you away. And he said, I'm not going. Fidel's the one who has to go. And he's always felt that change from Cuba has to come from within. the Miami community for a long time didn't understand this and didn't see him, didn't recognize the power that he had because of this idea. They thought, oh, he's a collaborator, he's working in, inside the Constitution. But actually, Oswaldo was every bit as radical as they were, but he had a different method. And I think that after he made a visit to Miami in 2003, it began to dawn on some people that what he was doing was actually highly important. But for a long time, it just wasn't seen there. And there was this division that's unfortunate. Again, this is something that Fidel designed, right? He said, I'll kick out of the country everybody who's against me, and they'll all go to Miami, and let them sit there and stew. And even today, I find that this is kind of a dictatorship that thinks that all it has to do is squeeze out the people that disagree. But of course, what you see is that things have gotten so dire that it's much bigger than that. Dissent is everywhere. Oswaldos are on every street corner. To be honest with you, Jorge, I am surprised at the durability of his message in the digital era. Oswaldo had no iPhone. Oswaldo had no email. He was just beginning to understand what bloggers were. The time that he collected those signatures for the Varela project was going door to door. This is a man who accomplished something extraordinary, 35,000 signatures, door to door, inspiring people to help him, creating small bases and teams of signature collectors. You couldn't just email your signature. You had to sign it and verify it. People gave their ID numbers. They they stood up to be counted. This wasn't anonymous. So I feel that Oswaldo today would be shocked at the power of Facebook for mobilizing. He didn't have that.
Yeah. And this is truly fascinating stuff. We have time for one last question, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to really address this with all the with full extent of detail. Obviously, a lot of our audience and folks in Spain will be aware of sort of the mysterious circumstances in which Oswaldo died. How close is the world to knowing the exact cause of his death, the exact circumstances in which he was in which he died? You've covered the issue, and you end your book with really a lot of detail into that. Tell us what needs to happen so that the world knows exactly what happened.
Oswaldo Payá was moving around the country even after the Black Spring and after all of his guys who had worked with him and women were imprisoned, 75 of them. They were released in 2010. By 2012, he was still working to try and bring the vision of the Varela project. A lot had happened at this point. New people were rising up. Oswaldo was a little bit of sort of like the elder statesman of this movement by 2012. He was 60 years old, and young people, bloggers and others had started to rise. But on this particular Sunday in July of 2012, he was going to Santiago de Cuba in order to train young people about democracy and how to continue to organize. But he couldn't just say take a plane or a train, because his name was on every list, and state security would stop. He couldn't buy a plane ticket or a bus ticket if they existed. He would be stopped. So he had to find a clandestine way to move about the island. And he had frequently done this with activists coming from Europe, places sympathetic to his cause, from Spain, from Sweden. The organization in Sweden frequently supported him. The organization goes by its initials, KIC, K-I-C. And in this particular case, they were organizing a trip that summer. And they had oftentimes sent somebody to drive Oswaldo in a rental car with the tourist plates. And the idea being, and it worked, that state security wouldn't be able to find him right away, and he could move about and organize. And this particular summer, the Swedish fellow who was coming also needed a partner. They were looking for someone with Spanish and someone with a driver's license. And this person who volunteered was Angel Caramero. I think he volunteered with a big heart and a desire to learn more about what was really happening. The other fellow, Aaron Modig, had already been to Cuba once, but Angel had not. And they went to Cuba to help Oswaldo Payá, and they were going to drive him that day to Santiago de Cuba. The trip was hastily, I should say, it was done a little bit hastily because the July 26th holiday was coming soon, and Oswaldo knew that on that day there would be militia out on the streets. He wanted to get down there and at least get on the way back before the holiday. So on July 22nd, a Sunday, they left very early in the morning from Havana. Oswaldo in the back seat with his protege, who I haven't mentioned, but another important person, Harold Cepero. Harold was in his 30s. He was learning to be sort of Oswaldo's future leader of young people. He and Maria, Oswaldo's daughter, were working on a magazine that was nearly finished and a program to bring more young people into the movement. So Harold and Oswaldo in the back seat, in the front seat, Angel Caramero and Aaron Modig. And, they drove a long time. They left at 6 a.m. They got to Camagüey around 11. They refueled the car. They had lunch. They passed through Las Tunas, and they were followed periodically. But after Las Tunas, they were followed by a new car that closed in rapidly on them, and the car had plates that showed it was a government car. And Angel, who was driving, could actually see as they got closer. He could see the faces of these guys in the car. They were rammed from behind by this state security car. It was on a sort of lonely country road between Las Tunas and Bayamo, and it was not a collision. Jorge, the car from behind shoved the car in front, and Angel lost control. Now, what happened after that is disputed, and I hope readers will read the book and judge for themselves. But there's one very important thing. They were deliberately rammed from behind. This caused Angel to lose control and led to Oswaldo's death. Harold was also killed. The two foreigners in the front seat survived. And the important fact I want to relate here, which I think says a lot, is that Angel was accused of being responsible for this and was put on trial in Cuba. And when the trial happened, the prosecution did not mention once at all this most important fact, that they were rammed from behind. So to me, that tells you a lot. The truth was whitewashed. The real facts were not presented. Angel was convicted and ultimately was released to Spain. But it was a sham trial. It didn't focus on the key facts. And the most important thing is that the state security took this action. Now, why? Were they attempting to harass the car when they hit it? Were they really attempting to kill them? Did Oswaldo actually die in the accident or later? There's a lot of questions which I can't answer, but I do know, because I have contemporaneous text messages of their discussions, that they were rammed from behind, and that's what led to Oswaldo's death. So at 60 years old, in July of 2012, Oswaldo Payá was killed. He was really murdered by the regime, and we don't know exactly how it happened. But I think your listeners should know, for years, Oswaldo Payá had been subject to death threats. And the threat was almost always the same. Somebody would come up to him on the street, somebody he didn't know, usually somebody from state security, and they would say, "You won't outlive Fidel Castro." Oswaldo and his wife Ophelia had 3 children. They were deeply, deeply fearful of what was happening. The threats got more frequent. The threats came just before he was killed. And Oswaldo was planning with Ophelia to send their children out of the country because they were so scared. So I think if you take the death threats and the actual death, and the fact the car was hit from behind and that the trial was whitewashed, you can reach a conclusion of what really happened.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, it's a very gloomy note on which to end this wonderful and wide-ranging conversation.
Well, let's not end it quite on that. I will say one more thing about this, which is if you look at the video of the protesters on July 11th, 2021, when 100,000 people went in the streets demanding liberty, and they were still holding up their hands with this, which is something that Oswaldo Payá had started to do when he thought about naming his movement Liberación. And this, when they did this, Oswaldo did not have what they had on July 11th. No Facebook. He didn't have the means to mobilize. New means have come along 20 years later, but the message and the inspiration are the same.
Yes, message. And
that's an upbeat note, and it's true.
Yes, and may future generations of Cuban opposition leaders, get some inspiration from Oswaldo's daring quest for a free Cuba, as you call it in the title of this wonderful new book. And I'm just going to encourage folks to go ahead and purchase a copy. It's a really worthwhile read, and we're hoping that a lot of folks out here in Spain will pick up a copy. David, thank you so much for joining me for this interview. Best of luck with the book, and thank you to everyone for watching.
Thank you for having me.